Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. Staying in. Today's session is structured with 3 sections and a discussion at the end. And each of the sections has a short presentation and then a poll for everyone to complete. The responses to the poll will be anonymous, and we'll share the collective data soon. And each of the sections will be about 10-15 minutes each. So you won't see the chat option at the bottom during the first half of the panel. We'll open that up for the discussion. And as a reminder, this session will be recorded and accessible afterwards.
We also know that this is a really big topic connected to much larger systemic issues, and we won't be able to cover everything in our 90-minute session, but hopefully we can strike a balance between the personal, the political, research data so that we can all have something to get out of this session. Jen?
Hi everybody, I'm Jen Delos Reyes, and this is another edition of Between Two Palms. And today my special guests are Lisa Lee and Astria Suparak. For those who don't get the reference, that is me doing my best impersonation of, well, wasn't that great, but my channeling of Zach Galifianakis's talk show, Between Two Ferns. But here I am, between two palms. And I just need to do this so everyone knows this is not a digital background. This is very real, and it is an indicator of the realness that's going to happen in this session. So let's get started talking about racism. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, so let's get it started. So today's conversation is going to focus primarily on the insidious and sometimes subtle forms of racism within the art world and the academy. But I'd like to take a moment to talk about some of the overt, dehumanizing, and violent forms of racism that I experience in this country in my everyday reality. This feels especially important to bring up in this moment where Asian bodies are currently a magnet for misplaced hatred, frustration, and blame during this pandemic. Even before the current global crisis, it would not have been uncommon for any of the following to happen to me, and all have. Having a TSA agent ask if I understand English, an Uber driver telling me they were surprised my destination was in Chinatown, being called Ching Chong by a preteen boy in my neighborhood, dating a white person and having their grandfather say at dinner, dating an Oriental. A lot of that used to happen during the war. Having white people ask me where the restroom is when I'm dining out because they assume I have to be staff. Being asked where I'm really from. Being yelled at in the street to go back to my country. And I wish I could say that that is the end of that list, but it does go on. And all of this only escalated for me since the pandemic, and I know this is the case for many others. I have friends from coast to coast who I know are more afraid to leave their homes due to the risk to their personal safety based on their identity than their fears of compromising collective safety. On April 22nd, the LA Times ran an op-ed by actor John Cho titled, "Coronavirus reminds Asian Americans like me that our belonging is conditional." I want to share some quotes from his piece that illustrate what so many of us are currently grappling with. Asian Americans are experiencing such a moment right now. The pandemic is reminding us that our belonging is conditional. One moment we are Americans, the next we are foreigners that brought the virus here. I called my parents a few nights ago to tell them to be cautious when stepping out of the house because they might be targets of verbal or even physical abuse. Across the country, Asian American parents and children are making versions of the call I made. Friends are sharing firsthand accounts of abuse on text chains and circulating articles on Facebook, always ending with the suddenly ominous, "Stay safe." Please don't minimize the hate or assume it's somewhere far away. It's happening close to you. If you see it on the street, say something. If you hear it at work, say something. If you sense it in your family, say something. Stand up for your fellow Americans. In part of our discussion today, we're going to focus on allyship, and I want to echo this statement that it is our responsibility to allyship and anti-racism, and this needs to happen in all aspects of our lives, at our jobs, in the streets, in the home. So thank you all for being here with us today, because that does give me hope and tells me that this is a baseline that we are all working at, or at least toward. So, how did this come to be? Why are we here? Over the course of the past 2 years, I would get messages from Astria when someone would mistake her for me or say we look alike. These were usually always white people making the comparison or the mistake. During these exchanges about mistaken identity, we would often share other stories of racism we experienced in the art world. Like the time I was once visiting artist residency that I was serving that same year on their equity committee. And part of our task was to address the lack of diversity in the staff, demographics of the residents, as well as other issues around access and inclusion. One morning while having tea in the communal space, I was approached by one of the male white staff members. He said there was a call for me on the landline, and he handed me the cordless phone. The call was not for me. It was for a resident with a Chinese-sounding name. We would also share similar stories about mistaken identities, including me being mistaken for Lisa while working at UIC. I suggested using our mistaken identities to our advantage, clearly being able to sub in for one another at professional events. I eventually joked, being the aspiring comedian that I am, that we propose a panel where we invite all the other Asian women we also get mistaken for to come together for a very special and mind-blowing occasion. Not all of us were available, but I was, and so was Astria and Lisa, and here we are now. So hold on to that hope, people. See, dreams really do come true. So this is an image of a text message that Lisa sent to me and Astria about one of the Asian celebrities she'd been mistaken for, and how in this instance she played along with it. I hope it was a really good massage. And per Lisa's request in that text message, here I am dressed as Yoko Ono's cut piece for Halloween. Yoko Ono is an artist that all three of us have been told that we look like. And have I ever told you how many times I've been told I look like Christy Yamaguchi? It's a lot, surprisingly. Almost all Asian Americans have a similar story of who they are compared to or are interchangeable with based on our identities. In Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, she shares about one of the first reviews of her poetry on a blog called Poetry Snark. And you know it can't be good with a name like Poetry Snark. Okay, quote, "He ripped on my first collection by describing it as hack identity politics poems. Then he compared me to Lee Young Lee. Not only do we look alike, we write alike, and declared that the poetry world would be better off if all mediocre minority poets like myself were exterminated." I immediately scrolled down to the comments section. Out of the dozen, there was not one comment that came to my defense, not even a weak-willed, half-hearted, "Hey man, promoting genocide is not cool," end quote. So I want to thank Common Field's selection committee for including this session in their lineup. It truly has been such a gift to have many hours of conversation with Lisa and Astria in preparation for this. I wish that we had recorded some of those so we could just play them for you now. But instead, as a way of introducing ourselves more personally, we're going to recreate a little bit of that more personal conversational feeling by each asking each other a question around race and our careers. And I'm going to start off with a question for you, Lisa. What does your mom think about your work as a cultural organizer, someone who works in the museum field?
Thanks, Jen. Well, honestly, my mom has no idea what I do as a cultural worker and museum professional. On the other hand, when I became a tenured professor, it was the first time she could brag to the gossipy aunties and uncles because this was more legible to them as respectable work. Both my parents came to the U.S. during a wave of immigration in the 1950s. The U.S. opened the borders to exceptionally overeducated Chinese young people in order to create a cheaper workforce of engineers, mathematicians, and doctors. She was actually an emerging published poet in Taiwan, but when she came to the U.S., she didn't speak English, and so she became an accountant. Neither of my parents endured the kind of fear of being terrorized during anti-Chinese campaigns, like in the mid-1850s, that Chinese immigrants who helped to build America through their back-breaking labor experienced. And for them, it wasn't like during the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first immigration law that banned a race from entering the U.S., and when Chinese people were depicted as rats, as lepers, as workers who stole jobs from good white Americans. Their experience, like mine, has been as a group that has been given advantages over Black and brown people. And for my parents, embracing capitalism became a sort of retribution for the insidious racism that they experienced in the US. It's like that satisfying scene in the beginning of Crazy Rich Asians. If you discriminate against us, we will make more money than you and buy your hotel that you wouldn't let us into. This is something that Kathy Park Hong, the book that you mentioned, also talks about. This is how whiteness recruited my parents. It ropes us into being their surrogates. And I definitely don't want to sound ungrateful because she worked 7 days a week, 12 to 18 hours a day at our family framing store in the South Hills Mall in order to pay for my education. And so I could have every advantage possible. And it is really hard for me to comprehend the cultural and the economic transformation she went through in order to survive in America. And I just wanted to quickly share a picture of my mom when she was back in China, and sort of then my mom and me later on. And I often stare at this and it's just so overwhelming to me. But honestly, neither of my parents have ever come to an exhibition I've curated, nor have they ever visited a museum that I have directed. And it's not that they don't love or appreciate arts and culture, because they're the ones who introduced me to museums. But that activity was very much part of what they stood as necessary to pass as a middle-class American and to be proficient in the white world. Okay, I'm now going to ask Astria a question. Astria, has your race ever been an advantage or disadvantage?
Well, I used to tour with curated film programs in my early 20s, sometimes with pop-up art shows or with performing artists and musicians. And I found out years later that a white male curator in a city I visited had, as described by one of his students, a hissy fit in front of his entire class. He complained that I was more successful than him. And he said, in his class, why her? Just because she's Asian? So he was disregarding all the work that I had done to that point, like years of work at dozens of art institutions and festivals internationally. And most of the places that hired me or booked my programs did not know what I looked like. In fact, when I showed up on tour, often people would say things like, oh, I didn't know you're Asian. And this was before Google image search, before social media, before people regularly searched for people online. So this man, who was in multiple positions of authority, was teaching his students that if a person of color is in a prominent position, it's not because they worked their way there. It's because of tokenism or some reverse discrimination bullshit. He was basically training students to think that people of color take away jobs from white people who are entitled to them, like him. So my question for Jen is, do people expect you to make work about your identity?
So during the final year of my BFA honors thesis, I remember my first crit with my committee. I showed them this very clean, stark video installation where I had projected this series of videos of like interviews I shot with these women around my age, also with very intersectional identities. I had asked them all the same series of questions and then had tiled the floor with the text of all the questions from the interview. So upon seeing the work, one of my committee members said to me that the piece was really impressive, but wasn't my voice. And she said it was the voice of my colonizer, and had suggested that to make it more in my voice, I could hang some Chinese lanterns in the space or splash red paint on the wall to symbolize menstrual blood. And obviously there was a lot going on in that comment, but what stung and shifted things for me in that moment was realizing how this racism affected me, and just that to this individual, I was only going to be seen as my Asian body. Like, that's the only part of my identity that was visible to her, you know, and unfortunately to a lot of other people too. And, you know, my intersectional identity just did not matter in that moment, that I could both embody colonizer and colonized all at the same time. Instead, aesthetically, she reduced my voice to a decorative, cheap object I could go pick up in Chinatown. So the rest of my thesis year, I ended up making work solely about Asian American identity, not because that's what I was drawn to or what had been the sort of like trajectory of my work or research up to that point, but because it felt like one of the only ways I could combat this racist encounter. And you know, I was really lucky to have a dear friend in school who at the end of the year at the final exhibition had said to me, "What are you doing? This is not your voice," you know, and to hear those same words again said in a different context with someone who actually saw me and took the time to know more of my story was able to kind of turn me around and got back on the path of the work that I do now and what led me to where I am now today.
And with that story of how people assume identity, let's take a moment to talk about how we actually identify.
Sure.
Lisa?
So I identify as a first-generation Chinese American, as a person of color, and as a cis woman. Astria?
I identify as Thai, as Southeast Asian, as Asian, as American, as Asian American, as a person of color, and a brown person.
I identify as a person of color, first gen, brown person, Asian American, Canadian, Filipinx, and cis woman.
We've got some jungle Asians in here too. Okay, so we're going to launch the first poll, and the question should pop up on your screen in a separate box, even if you're in full screen mode. And everyone will see the poll results, but not who said what. So be honest. Okay, so Jen, do you want to read that?
For sure. How do you identify? Do you identify as a person of color? Yes, no.
Where are my people at?
It's a race!
85% of you have voted.
It's a race.
90% of you have voted.
The POCs disappeared. Oh, wow.
Oh,
50.
it's pretty even. Last 8%, you have anything to say? I think we can close it, right? 93%.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. 50-50. Almost.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Should we share results? Lisa, are you doing that?
Oh yeah, I think somebody, there. So there's the results. Okay.
Thank you all for responding and helping to give us a little bit of a sense of who is with us in this virtual room.
Okay. All right. So my task in this first section is to give an account of the field through statistics to help describe the institutionalized racism that we are facing. Giving a full account must in some way include the assigning of accountability and the keeping of accounts, words that are intimately bound together not only through etymology, but in the work that must be done. In other words, honest storytelling, the taking of moral responsibility, and fiscal and financial transparency. This must all be part of the account one gives about diversity in the field. But before I hit you with all the data, I want to start, of course, with a poem by June Jordan called Calling All Silent Minorities. She writes, "Hey, come on, come out, wherever you are. We need to have this meeting at this tree. Ain't even been planted yet." And I start with her words to emphasize that what we need to fully give an account of in the field doesn't yet exist. But we still need to gather and do the work that needs to be done. The data that does exist tries to force not at all clear-cut things like gender and racial identity into boxes that don't reflect our lived complexities. The data we need would need to be intersectional, consider race, class, gender, and also take into account the long history and impact of white supremacy, the history of redlining that prevented people from accumulating generational wealth and privilege, the inequitable distribution of resources in different communities, environmental justice issues that have led to health disparities, and the trauma of police violence and mass incarceration, and much more. The data that reflects the lived realities of diverse people in the field. But nevertheless, the data that does exist still allows us to make some judicious and fierce observations. In 2015, the Mellon Foundation supported the very first comprehensive study of staff diversity ever conducted on museums. It was undertaken to replace anecdotal evidence with hard data and to provide the museum field with the first baseline against which progress could be measured. And in 2018, they followed up with another survey. The study found the vast majority of art museum positions, 74%, are held by white employees, and 26% by people of color. And while over the 4 years, the number of people of color increases, as you can see, from 26% to 35%, which might at first blush seem promising, we also need to consider what jobs people of color were hired to do in these institutions. But first, I just want to take a look at the breakdown of the people of color who were hired in museums. Black or African Americans make up the majority, followed by Asians, and then Hispanics, multiracial, followed by the smallest percentage of American Indian and Native Hawaiians. The biggest percentage gains are in Hispanic and multiracial identified staff, both of which almost doubled their percentage over the past few years. The next slide depicts the number of hires of all groups in, quote, intellectual leadership positions. And here you can see the vast majority of hires in these positions were white people. Among museum leadership, only 4% of employees are African American and 3% are Asians or Hispanic, which means that employees of color were therefore concentrated in facilities, security, and human resource jobs that lack a clear path of advancement to the most influential positions within institutions. Parenthetically, the very categories of the survey reasserts this Cartesian divide between mind and body and a division between intellectual and manual forms of labor. I really want to emphasize here that of the 35% of the people who are hired to work in the museum field who identify as a person of color, 90% work as janitors or security guards. The fact is that guards and janitors are the most diverse staff in museums, and they're among the least well-treated and the least paid staff in any museum. But we really didn't need a Mellon survey to tell us this. Artist Fred Wilson had already made this point in his work Guarded View in 1991 that confronted viewers with 4 black headless mannequins dressed as museum guards, each wearing a uniform from the Met, the Jewish Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. His work so painfully makes clear the contradiction of the black body in the museum, one which is at once hyper-visible through the forms of surveillance, yet hyper-invisible in terms of power and museum leadership. The representation of diversity in the museum field is also, of course, reflected in permanent collections, where male artists represent 87% and white people are 85% of all collections. You can see in this slide, Asian men and Latino men make up the other underrepresented artists, and the others They don't even get a dot. And on this front, museums in the United States have been moving forward, diversifying their permanent collections to remediate the historical underrepresentation of non-male and non-white artists, like the recent initiative, for example, at Baltimore Museum of Art to only collect female-identified artists over the next 2 years. I was wondering if we could parenthetically sort of imagine a parallel HR initiative where we only hire people of color over the next 2 years. Thanks. The next slide speaks to the other sort of representation and the data point for diversity that we need to consider. And of course, in this sort of moment of the pandemic, sort of museum visitorship becomes a sort of portal for museum diversity. We'll never take museum visitorship for granted ever again. By 2045, the US will become a majority people of color country. And yet, according to a recent study by the American Alliance of Museums, they would still, at the recent rate of attendance, represent only 9% of museums' core visitors. And then the sort of last data point that I want to present is the sort of the one around the diversity of boards. Several years ago, the American Alliance of Museums conducted a study called Museum Board Leadership. That study showed us that board diversity was appalling and came nowhere near mirroring the changing demographics by and large of the American population. Their survey revealed that 91% of board members are white, and 47% of boards are exclusively white. And while 77% of museum directors believe expanding the racial and ethnic diversity of their boards is important to advancing mission, only 10% of museums have actually developed any plan of action to become more inclusive. Board diversity has become a major focus over the last few years, and recently Darren Walker, the outspoken leader of the Ford Foundation, published an op-ed in the New York Times entitled "Museums Need to Step into the Future." And his focus was on the appalling lack of diversity of museum trustees on the occasion of the forced resignation of Warren Kander during the Whitney Biennial. But what was really striking to me was Walker's lack of acknowledgement of the activists and museum workers who have been organizing from within and outside of the institution for the past decades. Real change has never simply taken place from the top down, and in the museum field, there are so many movements that Walker does not mention that are shaking the foundations of institutions and demanding and creating change. Institutions change, and these people are doing this at precarity to their own positions, and they're pushing from change from the bottom up. And just quickly, I want to just note, this includes, workers at the Guggenheim Museum who voted to unionize and join Local 30, groups like Mass Action, a collaboration between the Minneapolis Institute of Art with stakeholders across the field, hashtag Museum Workers Speak, an action-oriented platform for social change, Wage, Working Artists for a Greater Economy, whose mission is to establish sustainable economic relationships between artists and institutions, which also in their manifesto demands payment for making the world more interesting. Museum Hue, an arts platform for people of color that disrupts homogeneity. Hashtag Decolonize Museums, efforts to not just invite Indigenous and other marginalized people into the museum to help institutions improve exhibitions, but an overhaul of the entire system in order to not replicate systems of colonialism and the exploitation of people of color. And of course, hashtag Museums Are Not Neutral, which by stating the obvious made us all aware of the ways that not taking a stand is of course a part of upholding unjust status quos. And I just want to end this section, not with statistics, but with a quote by a dead white guy. The past is never dead. It's not even dead. And I think this is really important for us to remember because we must be prepared to really truthfully consider what these institutions have been in the past to our ancestors, to the ones who came before us. We must acknowledge how instrumental these institutions have been in upholding the status quo of protecting power and privilege and actually actively preventing change. Accountability will require institutions to go against the grain, and for museums that means against the impulse to simply collect, organize, categorize, catalog, and interpret. It will require us to reject efforts to simply make sense of the past, to make what was dynamic and volatile more linear and safe. Challenging and transform institutions will require embracing diversity that will at first highlight the divides between us, foregrounding rather than erasing difference. It's not going to result in a homogenized version in which we all get along. It's going to be really difficult, but it will also provide the opportunity for us to truly create a universal humanism worthy of its name, one grounded in profound solidarity between people and histories, connecting us in unforeseen ways to build a collective future. Thanks. So after all these statistics about institutional diversity, I want to launch a few polls to check in on some of the aspects of the personal and political and the way people are experiencing racism in their own institutions. So if we can, I will stop my share and we can maybe launch the poll number 2.
All right, so if you're a person of color, answer number 1. If you're a white person, answer number 2. If you identify as both, you can answer both. But answer with the one that you feel more strongly that you identify with, or that you tell others more often. 3/4 of you have responded already. All right. Shall we share it?
Yeah. All right, so 25% yes, 1% no, not sure, and the not applicable would be the white people. And then for white people, let's see, yes, 8%, no, 25%.
Yes, 1/4 of people of color currently on this call feel that they have been passed over for an opportunity by a white person with less experience, and the same number, 1/4 of white people feel that they have not. All right.
And then we're going to launch the next poll. Julia, great, thanks. By the way, there's sort of an invisible Common Field staff member named Julia doing extraordinary Zoom work. Thank you. Educating others. Okay, people of color, do you feel you are often tasked with educating coworkers and peers and are solving and to dismantle institutionalized racism? Uh-oh. Oh, we know that is. This poll, just to note, it's only for people of color to answer. White people, you can just sit back and take a vacation and relax.
So we've got about 20% of people responded. 1/4 people have responded. 1/3. It's fun to see the behind the scenes tally coming through. Again, this is anonymous. We don't know how you're voting. We're just seeing numbers. Almost half of you have responded.
I'm so proud of the people who say no to serve on committees. I honestly have never said no. I always say yes. It's really great. All right.
Now you know you're in the minority.
Should I end the poll?
Okay.
All right. Sharing results.
So
right. We're doing a lot of extra labor there.
Yeah, 93% of people of color feel they have been tasked with educating coworkers and peers or solving and dismantling institutionalized racism, and about even whether people of color have said no to serving on a diversity committee or in a situation where they were expected to represent a minority. Yeah. Oh, we dropped off a word there.
That gives me hope. I like that. That's great. Kudos to those who say yes and no. So, all right, cool. And I'll just want to end the section with one sort of big question for us to ponder as we move forward. I was really struck by a quote that artist Lorraine O'Grady said, where she said, "In the future, white supremacy will no longer need white people." And so I guess my question for us is, when we unleash our radical imaginations, what fundamental things would actually change if there were more diversity in the field? Great, thanks. Now we're going to move to section 2. Astria.
So section 3, optics versus inclusion. So I've repeatedly been the only Asian person or the only person of color on public panels, juries, faculty rosters, and other invited groups for my entire career. In some of these instances, I've been replaced the following year by another Asian person, as if that department or organization could only conceive of one Asian or non-white position, regardless of the high percentage of Asians and other people of color in their student body, in the city's demographics, or in the field. In another instance, white curators invited me to tack on a supplemental section to their already curated all-white roster. They expected me to add diversity and historic depth to their embarrassing short-sightedness. So the positions most often offered to people of color in primarily white institutions, as Lisa showed us, are often precarious, prefaced by adjunct, visiting, or guest. One-time invites that diversify the lineup of an organization temporarily or superficially, or are lower in status and pay, such as maintenance, education, visitor services, and middle management. White people remain in most of the leadership, permanent, and tenured positions. So here's an image from the collective related tactics. It says, long-term decision-making is power, and it matters. If you do not have people of color on staff, serving on your board and in leadership positions, your organization is not diverse, inclusive, nor equitable. It does not matter how many artists of color you show or what signs you hang in your window. So we make the organizations look diverse and progressive, which helps them get more funding and improves their reputations. But we often don't receive the deeper support, resources, and security that enables success. The organizations do not invest in us. One type of cosmetic diversity is how Black and brown people are used in marketing materials, where the majority of organizations and the artists exhibited are white. Lisa, can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, sure, Astria. For the first solo show of a woman of color at the MCA Chicago, the museum broke with their standard practice of using an image of the artist's work to advertise the show. The museum instead chose to advertise Howardina Pindel's exhibition with a photo of the artist herself, deploying the Black female body as a marketing device. This artist is known primarily for abstract painting, and this is not even a photo that she took of herself. And even when the curator, who was the museum's first Black woman curator, objected to this, she was overruled by the marketing team and museum leadership. And so I thought that was extremely striking of how potent the Black female body is and how easily it is deployed in museum institutions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So during events at primarily white institutions, I've spent a lot of time like turning away from doggedly persistent cameramen who pursue my brown face in a sea of white. I've stepped behind taller people. I've awkwardly like twisted during conversations and sometimes resort to holding my hand up in front of my face. I was part of a group called Women Inc. and we coined the Benetton filter. Okay, the Benetton filter. When an art institution goes out of its way to photograph the few people of color in an event for use in marketing materials, aiming to create a sense that the audience is more diverse than it actually is. Okay, so now we're going to do a couple more poll questions. So this poll has 2 questions. So the first one is just for people of color who primarily identify as people of color to answer. Have you been expected to center your work on your race or identity? And if you're not a person of color, please click not applicable. Second question, people who identify as white, please answer the same question. And again, if you're a person of color, answer not applicable for number 2.
Yeah, and we totally see the questions that people and comments people are making about the poll, and that is correct. You have to answer something in order to get to the second question, and so we just won't not applicable, we're not even going to pay attention to that number. That is just more a device for people who aren't people of color, for example, in the first one, to go to the second question. Does that make sense? Because there are a bunch of questions filtering out that.
Okay, so we've got 90% of you have voted. More people who are people of color have been expected to center their work on their race and identity than not. And white people have not been expected to center their work on their identity. Okay, we could stop sharing that.
Yeah, and also I sort of feel like this is one of those where our own polling questions might be subjected to like a more intersectional lens, because I know that if you were to, for example, to put gender and sexuality into the question, I know that a lot of gay, lesbian, and trans artists who are white, for example, are definitely expected to make work about their identity, right? So I think there's some of that which we also would come into consideration. Cool. All right. Right.
Okay, so the big question for this section, something to think about, is how do you resist tokenism while simultaneously moving towards real inclusion and equity? So I'll put that in the chat. Okay, so that's just something to think about. And section 4, Jen.
Right. Well, time flies when you're having fun. I can't believe we're nearing the end already. So this is the final section, and this is on resistance and justice. And in this section, we are going to be really thinking through allyship. This is a big part of this section. So there's not going to be any presentations or slide sharing. It's really going to be the conversation portion of this session. And we are going to take a second now to describe a little bit of what we have planned, very in depth. But before I go any further, I want to ask Lisa to share the differences between allyship, solidarity, and coalition building that she shared with us in one of our past conversations that I think would be really helpful for readying the ground for our discussion.
Cool. Thanks, Jen. So my definitions are really informed by the work of Miriam Kaba and other movement builders whose #1 suggestion for impactful racial justice work requires a commitment first and foremost to do no harm. And so all of these three terms, allyship, coalition building, and solidarity, are frameworks for organizing and building relationships to create social change. But if our commitment is to harm reduction, some forms of organizing are much more effective and are better at bending the arc of justice. What do I mean? So, for example, coalition building includes forming a temporary alliance or partnering of groups in order to achieve a common purpose or similar goal. And each then is more powerful than together than if we're acting alone. But coalitions often make strange bedfellows. For example, if you are an advocate for independent media, one might form a coalition with the NRA or the Ku Klux Klan even, who are also fierce advocates for free press. And also more recently, conservative Koch brothers, for example, share a common purpose to reduce the amount of prisons in the US with many other mass incarceration groups. But a coalition might, while temporarily achieving a gain, might also actually create more harm. An ally is traditionally defined as someone who uses their relative privilege to advocate on behalf of an oppressed group. And allyship is a really effective way to take a stand as someone with privilege, helping someone who's actually marginalized. But in practice, sometimes allyship also arises from and perpetuates a sort of self-deluding savior mentality. And the hallmark of solidarity, on the other hand, shifts the focus on those who need it to the most rather than accommodating privilege. And this means that we are intentionally working to redistribute the ill-gotten gains of racism, jobs, schools, neighborhoods, housing, healthcare, and capital. And solidarity work is really directed towards dismantling structures and a willingness to address privilege and issues alongside those who face marginalization, not being in front of them paternalistically or behind them timidly. But most importantly, I just want to say that even though it's good to have the sort of frameworks of these definitions, racial justice work is going to include a lot of different kinds of relationship building, and it's definitely not an either or neither nor situation. And there is a kind of way that we get hung up on definitions. So, but I think it's good to sort of make a distinction too. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Lisa. That's super helpful. So this section is really about collective knowledge. We are not the experts in this digital room, and we all have so much to contribute and to learn from one another, as well as to support one another. So this is going to be a moment for us to respond to scenarios that people will have the opportunity to share. And, you know, just to say before we begin sharing, I want to say another quote from Kathy Park Hong in Minor Feelings. She says, "Racial trauma is not a competitive sport." So here are the ground rules for our engagement for this time together so that we can give as many people the opportunity to share as possible. I'm going to be serving as a timekeeper. Lisa is going to be monitoring the chat. Astria is going to be calling on people when we want you to unmute yourself and speak a little bit more about what you shared in the chat. And then whenever called upon to share, you're going to be given 60 seconds to say what you got to say. And then at the end of your time, you're going to hear a duck quack. When the duck quacks, that's your cue to finish up your thoughts, so then we can call on the next person to share. So if you haven't already done so, you can open up the chat function by clicking the speech bubble icon at the bottom of your screen and making sure that your message is set to everyone so that we can all read what you have to say. So we're going to have two prompts for the conversations. The first one is this. Take a minute to think of a racist work scenario that you want the group to come up with solutions for. So write it down, about 1 to 2 sentences, and you can put it in the chat. And I think Astria is going to post the prompt. Yeah, thank you. In the chat for all of you. Done and done.
I also just want to note that I noticed in the Q&A there were some really interesting questions that we'll also try and recover and talk a little bit about in this section. And we're going to try and make this work. And just remember, democracy is messy, folks. So it might get a little bit, you know, kooky, kakalaka here, but we'll see.
Well, maybe as people are sort of thinking and writing out their scenarios, I could start by responding to the very first question I saw pop up, which was someone had asked, how do we feel about the fact that it's such a mixed group right now in terms of people of color, people who identify as white? And I will say that that actually felt like something that gave me hope. Like, as we're talking about allyship and people willing to do the work, I want to see that, you know. I'm actually really happy that this isn't just falling on us as people of color. So that felt really nice.
I just want to say, I mean, I'm really feeling a lot of these comments, this sort of, that Sarah, for example, wrote to everyone where at events that women of color are expected to do all the cleanup at the end. Like, you could be the guest invited speaker or the keynote, and you are still the one sort of picking up the bottles and everything at the end. And I have to say that the number of times that white men who are lingering after the panel, who sort of see us all cleaning and say, hey, do you guys need any help? Is just so stunning to me. Like, you know, they also sort of need a personally engraved invitation often to like come and help and clean with us. So I'm just feeling that comment. Just wanted to say. All right. So do you want to, maybe there's somebody who talks about how do you deal with a white boss who takes it personally and cries when you don't tell them about your personal life. And I mean, maybe we could just say that there's no room for white tears. So Jen and Astra, how do you want to take some of these? There's a lot of comments coming in.
There are a few that we can condense into one question to open up for the chat.
Well, some of them are, like, I honestly think such good and common things, but there may not be like gigantic questions, but I am curious if people have solutions. Like, how do we correct someone in leadership when they mispronounce non-English words repeatedly, even after they've heard it said properly, a dozen times? That's from Sai.
I think, okay, so shall we start with that one in chat as well as discuss while people are responding to that?
It's harder than I thought because the chats of people with scenarios is like coming in between any kind of response that we might get. So,
yeah.
So maybe what we have to say is, for a second now, stop chatting scenarios, right? And what we want to do is workshop together as a group some answers and possible solutions to some of these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then we'll go back to the chat to pull out a few more scenarios.
Right. So We'll try to get through as many as we can in like the next 15 minutes, right? So it's like, does anyone have a solution to when people in power just keep mispronouncing words? Somebody is saying that even just documenting these scenarios is good.
That's great. Yeah, this is why we wanted to have this in the chat as well, so you can visually see all that. Okay, I'm trying to type up the scenario.
Ginger Brooks Takahashi has a great suggestion.
Send audio file of correct pronunciation via email. I suggest you send it to everyone in the organization.
Yes, I think that's good. Yes.
Yeah.
Also, writing out like a visual, or not a visual, but writing out how to pronounce certain words that are always mispronounced. I think that's helpful, like the audio file, the visual, like pronunciation key, and having those posted in key areas.
This is a good one. A co-worker who is a POC with the same position as a white person, but makes a lower hourly wage with more or less the same work experiences. I think that happens in a lot of institutions.
Okay, let's pull out another scenario if there aren't other solutions that you want to highlight.
Yeah, so there's some answers to that scenario. People say unionize, which I think is really, really important. And there are incredible unions forming now in the art world.
That's an answer to a lot of questions and our issues in general.
Yeah, and maybe that's, there are a lot of groups now working on salary transparency, which I think is really important. Like, never trust any boss or any sort of institution that says, oh, like, we just want to keep this your salary between me and you to keep it from other people. Like salary transparency actually helps everybody. That's really important.
I'd like to pull this one out of the chat for a solution because I think that it could be useful to hear some strategies for this, and it could apply to a lot of other things too. So, right, so this is a scenario in which this is an art handler coworker made a racist comment about an Asian artist video installation piece by calling the piece the Bruce Lee guy. I questioned why they were being racist, right? So I think a lot of people might experience a situation like this and not quite know how to disrupt, right? How to be an active bystander in the situation. So I would love to hear some suggestions from people of, if you saw that racism happening, what could you do to intervene in that moment?
And sometimes just asking the question, is that racist? Or either asking it as a question, sometimes with humor, or just stating it is useful. Say the artist's name, Lydia says.
Yeah, I think sometimes, so to bring up the question, is that racist, can be challenging in a way sometimes where all of a sudden defensiveness, right, will come up on the part of the other person. And and then it sort of like shuts things down or it escalates into anger. And I feel like Ibram X. Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, has a lot of great suggestions that are actually around asking different questions that sort of gets that individual to answer and realize that they are not a racist, but they have embodied racist thinking, and they are continuing to perpetuate that, right? Because I think everyone wants to say, no, of course I'm not a racist. But yet you might engage in these sorts of situations in which, like, if you then break down, well, if you're doing these things, if you're thinking these thoughts, if you're saying this, do you think that makes someone a racist? And then eventually they might be like, oh shit, I guess I was a racist. I shouldn't have been so defensive, right? But I guess I find that really helpful. That's
Okay.
from X. Kendi, and the book is How to Be an Anti-Racist. I highly recommend it. Also, you know, I think similar to this panel today, a lot of personal stories shared as moments to get into these bigger conversations of systemic and institutionalized racism.
So just to read a couple more lines that people have suggested, saying, what do you mean? And can you elaborate on that? Okay, so let's go into another scenario. Lisa, Jen, I'm just scrolling back into chat to find something, but...
Me too.
Yeah, me too.
There's a lot of reading here.
See, I knew we should have had music ready for these moments.
I know. I'm also just learning a lot reading the comments. And so
I actually think it would be great to try and share the suggestions when we share the poll information too.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one from Leanne. I was in a show and had submitted my bio with my background as an Asian-born person right at the end. The exhibition manager rewrote my bio with my background in the first line ahead of my valid accomplishments. They would never have done that to a white person. I got my way in the end, but never pointed it out that it was a racist thing to do. So that's a question. That's a great question. That's something that I think about often too, is the decision to have your identity, your ethnic, racial, or other identity in your bio, and when someone foregrounds that in a different way than you have.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, because I think that, you know, there's a part where in different points of my life, I've been more proud, I guess is the word to use, of being an Asian American, in the sense that, like, at one point when I was living in the South, I just always insisted that people use my middle name, which is Ring, like Y-U-N, so that people would know that I was Chinese American, as opposed to like associated with the other Lee, which is a common Southern name like General Lee, you know? And so there's a kind of way where, you know, and we know that now in the art world, there have been, you know, African-American artists who've sort of said, I refuse to be part of exhibits, you know, that are curated just if it's a show dedicated to African-American women, for example, or something like that. And so I think some of that is, of course, it's the institution wanting to display in the optics of our thing. But I think sometimes there's probably some artists out there who really want that to be the first bio line too, you know? But I'm not sure. I wonder.
Just a reminder to folks, someone just put in the chat, if you haven't changed your setting, please make sure that you are sharing with everyone. Some people are concerned that maybe you might just be chatting to the panelists because they're not seeing that. So just make sure that's a setting that you have.
Let's do time check. It's 2:10. We have 20 more minutes. So should we do one more scenario and then go to the next question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a scenario here which I think is unfortunately so common, which is, how do you speak up when you're the only person of color in an entirely white institution? Like, I think that's a hard one because, you know, people have a kind of precarious position, and I'm wondering for other people out there, what are some of the solutions? Like, people are saying that they feel like they have no power, they're so tired. Lien Chong sort of wrote that recently.
Someone earlier in the chat had said that they were so frustrated always having to be the person who's a person of color, also like correcting names and things like that and pronunciations. And one suggestion I remember reading was that if you are in that situation and you might be the only person of color in an all-white organization or a situation, that you actually have a conversation with a coworker that you consider an ally and ask that they be the one who says something anytime that happens. Sort of like explain that this has happened all the time and I'm tired of being seen as the angry Asian person who has to say this over and over. So I think there can be very specific conversations and alliances that are made to help with some of those situations too.
Yeah. And that's one in which allyship, I think, works great. Like in meetings, like having white allies who are willing to be the first people to step up and say, hey, that's not right, I find that racist, is actually really helpful. So it doesn't always put the person of color in that position.
Lisa wrote, with an open letter, media contacts, mutual friends in high places. Antonio says, many of these complaints can be filed with the Human Rights Commission in your city for investigation. What if there are no allies?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
I don't mean to undercut the Human Rights Commission, but I could just imagine the letter, which is like, Dear Human Rights Commission, all of our institutions are racist and completely terrible. Oh, that's interesting. I really like that solution too.
Read it.
And it's from user to the all panelists, that when I have dealt with frustration of speaking out and fear of making too many waves, I've tried to find a safe person in middle management, and so that there also can be people who are not necessarily, like not always sort of looking up in management and thinking that the change has to come from top down, but then also looking around us and finding allies in different spaces. And I mean, I just want to like maybe throw out one mention here because I didn't, explicitly talk about the IT and tech staff at museums, but there's been a lot of work organizing IT and tech staff, and people know the work of Nikhil Trivida, who has been, at the forefront, like talking about there's a lot of diversity in IT, and they're sort of so behind the scenes in the art field and in the museum world, and many of them are anti-racist organizers and very invisible, I think, to people who are cultural workers sometimes, but I think that's a really good group to be thinking at too and to be reaching out to.
I think this comment is important, that a lack of true HR in museums only contributes to employees not feeling comfortable with addressing racial issues. I think that's definitely the case at a lot of organizations too, smaller arts organizations.
Yeah.
Shall we pull one more scenario?
I think at this point, since we only have 15 minutes left, let's move on actually to our second prompt to give it as much time and space.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Can I point out one thing? Because somebody sort of says that there's a lack of true HR in museums. And I think that's a really important factor in institutions, that they don't have human resources, that places and people who are actually trained in diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. But one side note that I also want to point, that sometimes HR is so hung up on the legal aspects. And something that I always want to remind myself of is that, if we're going to have a socially just world, it may not be the law that actually saves us. At one point, it was legal, for slavery to exist. It was legal to stop women from voting. And the law really has to catch up sometimes with the organizing and work that we do. And so I think sometimes the sort of HR spaces are seen as like, they're like false shelters, because they're just like, we're here to follow the law. And, even though that's important, the law is not actually just for many of us. All right, cool. Sorry, go ahead, Jen.
All right, so our final prompt for this session is so now we've like talked about these very specific situations, right? And this final prompt is a little bit bigger picture. These are more like the smaller situations, but this next one, you can sort of try and address the larger systemic issues that we've been talking about, right? So what are the tips you'd like to see allies use to address racism in the art world and academy? So what are some things you would like to see allies using or doing to address these sort of systemic issues in the art world and the academy? We're going to paste that in the chat.
Okay, people are still responding to the HR question, but we're going to switch to the final prompt.
Great. Maybe some of this we could just read out. Yeah, Astria?
Yeah.
Uplift work being done by people of color on their platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Redistributing
Lisa,
power. Yeah.
From Lisa, I would like white colleagues to demand Black, Indigenous, people of color in leadership roles.
Yeah, that's great.
Transparency and being really upfront about what demographics are within their institution. That's from Joe.
Yeah. From PJ, we should have systems in place to support each other through the hiring process, how to find jobs, how to interview, and how to negotiate. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I want to make a point. Hi, PJ. Related to that comment too, is that like, and once hired, what are our support systems within the institution that actually keep us there and diversifying institutions? Because I'm so tired of seeing these hires happen. And then those people of color leave because of the incredibly toxic situation that they have been dropped into, in which there is no support, no allies, and it just perpetuates the whole cycle.
Yeah, and Nick Wiley, hi Nick, says that boards should join in and be prioritized in diversity, equity, inclusion, and access training. And I know that there's a lot of good work being done around that. Here in Chicago, for example, there's a whole movement in realizing that just because you are a person of color on a board doesn't mean that you actually are an ally or, sort of in solidarity with people of color because of the way that racial oppression has intersected with class and other forms of privilege, right? And so most people get on these boards because they have money and they're established, and they may not necessarily be willing to also step up to actually be a voice for justice.
I'm going to quickly read off a few from Christina. Redistribution of power, especially by white people who should also compromise their money. Jacqueline, transparency about salaries and benefits. Roshan, step back. Nick, boards should join in or be prioritized in trainings, DEI. Lisa, I would like white colleagues to speak up more instead of waiting for people of color to say they're hurt. Yes, please. Go ahead, Jen.
There's one here by Nisha Hussain that says, stop giving grants and fellowships to white people to make and curate work about POC bodies. And that really reminded me of something that we talked about, the three of us, around the frustration of institutions being rewarded with more funds for essentially doing terrible work around diversity and inclusion, right? So when an institution does not have diverse sort of staff populations, that all of a sudden they'll get this major grant to try and rectify the situation, but then you're putting people of color into this like unsupportive environment instead of rewarding institutions and organizations that are clearly doing the work well, right? That are actually diverse. And so how do you further support that? And I know like what I'm saying is a little bit like, well, you need to be able to do both. And I think you do, but I just like that comment really made me think of the reward, right? Like being rewarded for doing a bad job.
I think that's so important. And I just really want to sort of call out the Mellon Foundation in this because, they are so committed to ending, sort of all white institutions, but that's exactly what they did. They gave major funds, millions of dollars to institutions like the Art Institute and other places to actually diversify their staff and create pipelines. Meanwhile, there are so many cultural organizations, institutions, not in the mainstream, who actually have many people of color, and they could have distributed those resources to those people too instead.
few more from the chat. Dorothy says, invite community members into the hiring process. That's great.
That's
Jojo, tell administration that inclusivity efforts have to include money. Yes.
PJ. Oh, sorry, go on. Tell what PJ has to say, then I'm going to share Latham's.
Making sure to bring in and cite people of color and highlight their voice.
Yes.
Go ahead, Jen.
Similar, Latham says white people can/should highlight the expertise and good work and leadership happening by POC folks on their teams, asking their opinions in group conversations and broader issues, not tokenizing.
Yeah. And I also just want to call out the suggestion about the hiring to include community members, because right now for the highest level, like the C-level positions, they really are relying on these extremely white, sexist search firms to do the work. And those search firms really need to be called out. They are essentially corporations who have been, like the Catholic Church, sort of moving sexual harassers from one institution to another and placing them in positions of power. And, they sort of go under the radar and they get paid a lot of money to find intellectual leadership for museums and institutions. And when people get placed in these institutions and it turns out what terrible human beings they actually are, like those search firms actually need to be held responsible and they need to be a part of the account and be held accountable. Sorry, Lisa rant.
Chanel says, no more hidden allies. Reyes says, allies be wrong sometimes. Being an ally accomplice means you're putting something at risk.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that comment. It reminds me of that Portlandia skit where Carrie's playing this woman who's the first female hire in like a legal firm, and she's sort of talking about her story and a lot of the sexism that she encountered, and then all the white men at the table were like, but not me, right? But not me. And like taking the energy of like needing to be forgiven or being told that you're doing it right, when sometimes, you did something wrong and you can recover from that and learn and grow and do it different next time.
Also, I just want to say you all are real funny. Like Kate Clark to everyone, white people become the tired ones. That's great. Yes. We all know that rest for people of color is an act of resistance.
From academic programs, white allies should all take implicit bias training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually think we all should, too. I mean, there's sort of, all of us are in that space and living in an extremely racist world. And so I feel like that should just be like sort of typing skills. It's something that should become so rudimentary into the everyday sort of vernacular work of what we're expected to do and know. And I think that would be really great.
Lisa froze for a second. I'm going to read a couple more. From AD, as a white trans guy, I try to use individual and structural tactics, e.g., in meetings, I announce that white men can't leave until everything is cleaned up.
Love it. Snaps.
From Ashley, ending unpaid internship models. These barriers to entry prevent arts workers of color from ever even getting in the door. We've got 4 more minutes for our session. Sorry, 4 fingers.
Yeah, these are all really good. I really want to preserve the chat and find a way of maybe just, of documenting it and sharing it with people.
Yeah, so much to go through, so much here. I like this one, coming to terms with why giving up power and privilege is a challenge. It's from Ashley.
Yeah, and I also, think it's important. Maura Williams wrote in about her own identity as a disabled Indigenous person. And definitely, I feel like solidarity with people who are disabled is one of the most important, sort of on the forefront of social justice movements that we all need to be at. And, you know, this particular pandemic moment has sort of created a space where, you know, creating tools and creating educational materials for people who can't come to the museum has, you know, been really foregrounded. And I think this is the moment, like, for us to also express like incredible solidarity with people who might not be able to come to the museum because of their disability, to figure out ways that the institution can serve them. So thanks, Maura.
There's incredible stuff in this chat. I can't read it all, but I'm glad I'll be able to. We'll all be able to later.
Good news. Confirmation that the chat will be preserved and shared.
Yeah.
Well, maybe since we only have 2 minutes left, I will start to wrap things up, if that sounds okay. Yeah. All right. So I want to start this wrap up by sharing a quote from the Arts Collective related tactics. Quote, "Not all people of color are here to educate, help, or work from some obligation to assist you with your mission. Some will take the time and some will not. Both choices are acceptable," end quote. I'm really glad that Lisa, Astria, and myself made the choice to take some time to come together today and share our experiences and hold space for this conversation. And I'm so grateful to the over 200 of you that joined us this afternoon to also share your own wisdom, collective knowledge, experiences, and we look forward to sharing that back out. So, you know, being here with all of you, willing to engage in this way really does give me hope, and that is something that I feel like I need a lot of right now, and I'm sure others probably feel the same. I'm going to share another quote by Arundhati Roy, her piece, Pandemic as Portal. I've been thinking about this one a lot, and I'm sure many, many people have. So, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their worlds anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And so as we leave this session, I would love for you to each write one word in the chat to describe what you want to hold and carry on to as we travel lightly together in this new world that we're building. So that would be great, and thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen and Astria. I adore you. Thank you so much for your cultural work and activism. Thanks to Common Field. And yeah, I'm just so impressed that you all also came and joined us in this webinar, and really appreciate your thoughts and your work.
Thank you. I'm just going to watch this chat until they kick us out.
Yeah, it really boosted me up. Thank you for all these beautiful words and thoughts.
And for attending on such a nice stay in Oakland, California. Not that you have much choice because we're all shelter in place. Or some of us are.
Represent. Oh, thanks.
Put our Instagram tags up.
Mine's just at my name, at Jen Delos Reyes.
Mine is at Doc Lisa Yun Lee, Yunlee.
Lisa
That's my pop name.
And also, if you want more information about us, Common Field's website has information on all the presenters. So,
Kim Yasuda.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, Kim. All right, great. Should we sign out?
There's still a lot of people like signed in right now, so they could just hear us talk and slowly read the chat. And thank you everyone who asked questions early on. We were not able to monitor that while we were presenting, but I'm definitely excited to go through all the questions and comments that you put in throughout the last hour and a half. There's still 150 people, 130 people here.
Yeah, I know. I love these single words.
Yeah.
What's an IG name?
Instagram.
Oh. I was like, is that a different, like a sort of people of color version of OG something?
Total number of attendees, the question, like close to 400 people had signed up. And at one point during the panel, I noticed that there was like 230 or so people who were logged in. I'm sure Common Field will get us those numbers after.
And somebody just asked the Mellon Foundation study. And the Mellon Foundation study was the one that was conducted in 2015 on staff diversity. It honestly is the only major study that has been conducted. And so if you just type in museum staff diversity Mellon, it will just come up and you can download the PDF of that work.
From PJ, no more funding on studies, fund positions. Well, we did a study today, though, with the polls.
That's good. I know. And the next conversation we'll have to have is about a reparations movement. Sort of like kept that on the DL in the background, but for real.
Is it okay to post one of your slides on social media? Asks Joe.
Yeah, I just saw that. I was going to say that's fine.
Yeah,
with me. Thanks for asking. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Maybe tag whoever is like who was presenting at that time if you know. But thank you. Yes, always tag for credit. I think that's great practice. I think everyone should do that.
Yes, I forgot to tag in my slides. Sorry, Astria.
It's okay.
All right. I'm actually going to sign off.
We're going to miss you so much if you go.
But we'll definitely, there were people who asked us to send a list of the readings that we mentioned. And, you know,
I'm gonna be
I can't say enough about it. It's so good. And so that's really important. But we mentioned a bunch of different authors and quotes and people like that. And we'll definitely try to find a way through Common Field to send them out to you. Okay?
There's some podcast recommendations in the chat.
Nice.
Oh, thank you. This was our first time doing something like this, or at least my first time.
I just want to say that someone earlier said that the three of us have great chemistry. And have we collaborated before?
Also, the last 103 participants can know that we coordinated our shirts for this palm tropical look for today.
Yeah, and I can say that we have all worked together in different capacities in the past. Lisa used to be at UIC, and so worked very closely with her. It's the most joyous time of my work life ever, and now I will always look back at that moment. And then Astria, we've had some public conversations together in Chicago, and I feel like we get to see each other often, which is nice, in different places, different modes.
Yeah, and I've just experienced so many of your amazing shows that you've curated, Astria. Yeah. So sort of know you from that.
Oh, thank you.
Kate says we wanted Zoom. We did it.
Yay, Zoom!
Yay, we won the Zoom.
No
All right, good. I think we should log out now. Now it's just oh my gosh, Dorothy says we did the best Zoom ever.
We could have logged out before that.
Thank you.
I can't believe how many people are still on this chat.
I know. They're dropping now, though.
Yes.
I cannot catch up with all this, the chat. Favorite new show?
It's basically new show. Asian style.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's sweet. And I actually think we should do Between Two Palms, aka Asian style. We'll let you know, Megan.
Thank you.
Full disclosure.
Thank you again to Julia and Mirabai, the captioner.
And Maud for organizing. Really appreciate you, Common Field. Thanks. Bye. I think we can end it now.
Thank you. For the 12th time. Yes. Okay.
All right.
I will leave meeting.